Okay, so let's go ahead and get started, and others can join as they are able. So again, welcome to our conversation today. We have a conversation with Jane Connors, who is the Victims' Rights Advocate in the United Nations, and we're really excited to co-host this as the Global Women's Institute, as well as the Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University. We wanted to start off first by introducing ourselves and our institutions a little bit more for those who may not be familiar. So I will kick that off. We can go to the next slide. So for the Global Women's Institute, we're based at George Washington University and really focus on action research around violence against women and girls, women's empowerment, and gender equality. My name's Alina Potts. I'm a research scientist at the Global Women's Institute. We're joined this morning by colleagues Elizabeth Hedge and Skylar Wynn, and who work as well as research associates, and Amal Hassan, who's a student research assistant with us. So we're excited to have this team together today. Our aim is to produce a strong knowledge base to inform programs and policies that address a variety of issues affecting women and girls. And we focus on really participatory, rigorous methods, working with partners in humanitarian and development settings. So one word about a specific project that we do and that Liz and I in particular work on, Empowered Aid. This is a participatory action research in Uganda and Lebanon, which works with women and girls living in refugee setting or living as refugees in those settings to examine the ways in which accessing humanitarian aid, so accessing food, water, shelter, etc., can open up risk for sexual exploitation and abuse. Understanding those risks better, and then applying their recommendations to address those risks to actual aid distributions, working with the partners that you see here, which are non-governmental organizations, so CARE and ORDA in Lebanon, and IRC and World Vision in Uganda. So I wanted to share more about this project because it really links to the discussion today and some of the topics that we'll be talking about. And also, as Ms. Connors says in her work, this project aims to put the voices of those most affected at the center and have them drive the change that we need in both policy and programs. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Ramin, to introduce the Milken Institute a bit more and our student presenters.
Sure. Thank you, Elena, and thank you everyone for joining us today in this very interesting and important webinar. Ramin Asghar is my name. I'm the Director of Humanitarian Health Program at, in the Department of Global Health within the Milken Institute, the School of Public Health at George Washington. We have an MPH program in humanitarian health, and really the idea of this program is to train people to be practitioners in humanitarian health, to basically show up in the places that there is need and be able to provide services, contribute to better policy making and improving the efficiency of aids. It's a 2-year program, and we collaborate with a lot of NGOs and non-NGOs agencies at international level. And our niche really is to basically train people to be able to address those kind of implementation challenges in humanitarian aid. So I'm going to introduce 4 of our students. We have Katrina Gianjobi, who is our 2nd-year student in the MPH program. We have Megan Kincaid, who actually is one of our recent graduates, who's working in New Mexico in COVID response. We have Jesse Weber, who is our first student in our humanitarian health program, and all of them, they have extensive background in global health before joining us and at this moment. And Amal Hassan, who is an undergraduate at Milken and obviously working as a research assistant in the Women's Institute, Global Women's Institute. Again, thank you for coming. I'm going to hand it over to the next person.
Thank you so much, Ramin. I think that's you, Megan.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be introducing Ms. Jane Connors. Ms. Jane Connors is the United Nations Victim Rights Advocate on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. Previously, she served as the Director of International Advocacy for Amnesty International. From 1996 to 2015, she held various positions at the United Nations, including the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. Before joining the UN, she held academic posts in the United Kingdom and Australia, including 14 years at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Ms. Connors is published widely on UN human rights and mechanisms and human rights of women and children, in particular gender-based violence.
Yeah, we're so excited to welcome you and to have this conversation with you, and especially want to know, your interest in bringing this conversation to students and to universities. Um, so I'd like to actually start it off by asking you to kind of set the scene around, your role and your mandate within the UN. Oh, and there you go.
Yeah, that's it. No, at least the system tells you you're being silly. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here this morning. I think, I don't know whether you're in different time zones, but I'm in New York City. And I'm extremely pleased that this is a joint event with the Global Women's Institute and the Milken Institute School of Public Health. And it's delightful. It's really, really wonderful to see how participatory the organization of this webinar has been. And I know that you and your colleagues, Alina and Ramin, have worked with my colleagues in its organization. And just before I start, I hope everybody is well and safe, and those that they're close to are also well and safe. What I'll do for hopefully not too many minutes, I often go on too long, but you can stop me, Alina, at any moment. I'll provide some background, and then I'll outline my work. And I know that the students have had available, students and colleagues have had available to them some documentation, and I've seen from the questions that were sent through to me that they've read some of this documentation, which is always heartening. Just on background, it's important to note that we have 100,000 staff members in the United Nations, and the United Nations consists of 35 separate entities, and it's a system, more or less a federal type system, and it's very complex to describe, and I won't go into that. So we have 100,000 staff members. We have many non-staff personnel who are considered as UN personnel. So they include 100,000 or over 100,000 uniformed military and police. And we have countless contractors and people who implement our programs on the ground. And the vast majority performs their work with integrity and in line with all of the United Nations principles. And indeed, their service provides benefits to many, and they often work in difficult, sometimes extremely dangerous situations. And I know Alina and Ramin, you and your colleagues would be aware of some of the situations in which they work. Notwithstanding all of that, we have a very difficult situation in that we have allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse. Originally, people associated this with people in uniform, peacekeepers, police and soldiers, but also we now know that these misconducts also affect humanitarian and development personnel. And many of these allegations that have come forward have been substantiated. Of course, their victims are the women, men and children that they've pledged to protect and support. Not only do we have these issues, and I don't want to deflect from our issues, but also people working in charities and other organizations delivering humanitarian and development aid have been involved in sexual exploitation and or abuse. And they're very close to us because often those people implement our programs on the ground. We don't have enough people to do that, and we call them implementing partners. We know that these wrongs cause harm and suffering to victims. They often leave them with children, and they also have profound negative impacts on communities in the short and longer term. And I think what we see is they normalize these behaviors, suggesting they're permissible. Fracture trust amongst the populations, they undermine our credibility and legitimacy, and sometimes they frustrate our work, and they can be used, and whenever I speak to government officials in countries, they draw attention to the wrongs that are perpetrated by the United Nations, some frequently, I suppose, to deflect attention away from the very, the wrongs that are being perpetrated by their nationals and by those who are in the country. There's a very interesting book that's worthwhile looking at, Violating Peace, Sex Aid and Peacekeepers by Jasmine Kim Westendorf. And she describes how these behaviours create an exploitation economy, which remains well after our personnel have left. And that exploitation economy is always there and ready to click in again when another disaster hits. We've looked at these allegations for over 20 years. Successive Secretaries General have introduced what is called a zero tolerance policy, and there have been many prevention and response measures introduced. And I just wanted you to know that their overarching policies are in 6 core principles of the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a coordinating mechanism for UN and non-UN partners providing humanitarian assistance. But more or less the legislative framework, if you could call it a legislative framework, is set out in a bulletin of the Secretary General adopted in 2003. And I'll talk a bit about that bulletin, not much, but just to indicate the definitions. That bulletin, that is more or less accepted across the 35 entities of the UN. And it also is reflected in the Memoranda of Understanding for military contingents and formed police units that we conclude with contributing countries. And on definitions, sexual exploitation is defined as any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power or trust, monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of another, whereas sexual abuse constitutes the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or unequal or coercive conditions. And just remember, this is 2003, and when you think of domestic provisions relating to, I don't like to call it violence against women any longer, but because it suggests, it sort of elides the perpetrator, but that's what people call it. So violence more or less inflicted against women and girls. But the bulletin, it's quite progressive for 2003. The bulletin also prohibits sexual activity with a child, and that for us is a person under the age of 18. And this becomes a bit confusing because it's irrespective of the local age of majority, which can be quite young. Some countries don't seem to have a local age of majority. Irrespective of the consent of the individual concerned, or the mistaken belief of the perpetrator. So you're not going to be in a position getting off saying, oh, she looked a lot older. It also prohibits any exchange of money, employment, goods or services for sex. And that is also, there's no exception for national context. So if, for example, sex work, prostitution is legal, that doesn't matter as far as the UN is concerned. That is behavior that should not be engaged in. And it doesn't matter about the country of the perpetrator, say they come from wherever they come from, and prostitution or sex work is legal, or again, the perceived consent of the victim again. It describes sexual relationships, and I think this is interesting because it's an issue that runs across humanitarian and development workers as well in other organizations. It describes sexual relationships between UN staff and beneficiaries of assistance as being based on inherently unequal power dynamics, which undermine the credibility and integrity of the work of the United Nations. These, it says, are therefore strongly discouraged. A couple of years ago, 2019, the Interagency Standing Committee that I spoke of sought to clarify this, stepping up the strongly discouraged some way. It didn't do it very well, by providing that any sexual relationship between those providing humanitarian assistance and protection that involves improper use of rank or position is prohibited. Such relationships undermine the credibility and integrity of humanitarian aid work. And essentially, this is an area which is contested. The fundamental issue is whether the relationship between the UN staff member, the NGO staff member, and the beneficiary is truly consensual, is a genuine relationship. And it's very difficult because beneficiaries are in profoundly vulnerable situations. So the issue of consent becomes a problem. This bulletin indicates that these acts constitute serious misconduct and are grounds for administrative and disciplinary measures. Where they're substantiated, if you're a UN staff member, you're dismissed. And if you're uniformed personnel, you're repatriated, because the disciplinary measures for uniformed personnel lie in the state which provided them. From the end of 2018, the names of individuals with substantiated allegations, as well as those who left for any reason during an investigation, because often people leave when things are getting close, are included in a UN system-wide database called ClearCheck, in which 25 out of 35 entities participate. And the idea of this database is to preclude further re-employment or mission service. As people tend to move on, seek if they've moved to a different, hope that their history doesn't follow them, but ClearCheck has been put in place to ensure their history does follow them. So 309 individuals are in this database at the moment. 211 relate to sexual exploitation and abuse, and 98 sexual harassment. So it pertains to sexual harassment as well. I deal a bit with sexual harassment, but I'm not the advocate for victims of sexual harassment, although they come to me. There have been 77,000 checks since the introduction, and no one has been ruled out. So I think the very existence of ClearCheck may have discouraged people from applying. There are discussions in non-UN system entities to open the system to them, because the other thing that happens is that the people move from the UN to other entities, and there are many stories about these people, unfortunately. There are some hurdles here because of data protection and related issues. But we still get, all of that is there. I could tell you about many things, but we still get these allegations. They're reported on our website in real time, or sort of real time as far as the UN is concerned. And any of you who've looked at the annual report on special measures for protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, which was published last week, became available last week, will see that there's a section in the report and an annex on the data. Since 2015, the allegations relating to uniformed personnel identify their country and where the incident occurred. Allegations relating to civilians in missions, so in peacekeeping civilians, identify the mission, but others, there's no other identification. We know that these allegations in no way, the numbers we have in no way reflect the real incidents. It's very difficult to work out what the real incidents would be. There, of course, allegations surface in media and academic research. Some of you might have seen articles published by the New Humanitarian in late September last year. The New Humanitarian follows this work very closely, so it's always, I suppose every week there is an article about the UN and sexual exploitation and or abuse. And those articles pertain to the Ebola response in Eastern Congo. When this Secretary General, and he's up to see whether he can get another term, another 5-year term, when he took up his, even before he took up his post, he said he wanted to prioritize prevention and response to sexual exploitation and abuse. And his first week on the job in early 2017, he tasked one of his staff to develop what is described as a game-changing strategy. A lot of things are described as game-changing. That strategy appears in his 2017 report. And it has 4 aspects. Putting the rights and dignity of victims first, that's my job. Ending impunity, building a multi-stakeholder approach, and I am very keen on that because everybody's in this. You can't, any entity that engages with people in very vulnerable situations is affected by this sort of possibility, that the people that who work with people in very vulnerable situations may engage in sexual misconduct with them. And then finally, reorienting United Nations communications towards transparency and creating a global platform for sharing best practices. I won't go into the whole, I'll just talk about my role. And I know that I'm talking for too long, but putting the rights and dignity first. And this cuts across all elements of the strategy, and I do engage in all the other elements as well. This is new, and I was involved in a high-level meeting yesterday. There are many high-level meetings in the UN, but one of the participants spoke of how unusual it was to create a victims' rights advocate in an international organization. And the focus is a radical shift compared to earlier strategies. They privilege the reputation of our organizations, and that seems to be the default. When anything happens, there still is what's bad for the organization. And they privileged also the conduct and discipline of personnel, but they didn't get to the root of why the behavior persists. So the idea is to remember that there is an affected person, and that's quite difficult for some of our organizations, some of our colleagues, and that doesn't only pertain to the UN. Some of you might recall the Oxfam scandal in 2018. The reputation of Oxfam was a big issue, whereas what happened to those young women in Haiti, I don't know whether that was thought of in great measure. My role is the operationalization of that first prong, putting the rights and dignity first. And my role is to work, well, this is how they describe it, to work across the UN system at headquarters and the field, to identify ways to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and if they occur, to promote and protect victims' rights to report and receive support, to ensure their cases are properly managed and perpetrators held accountable. At the same time, this role was created, and more or less as I was appointed in August 2017. Field victims' rights advocates were identified in the 4 countries from which we'd had the greatest number of allegations. Those countries are Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and South Sudan. From 3 of them, the ones in Africa, we still get many allegations. In terms of Haiti, the issues we're dealing with are older claims, which engage paternity child support claims. And we're working with victims we know, victim survivors we know, and their children in order to satisfy those child support paternity claims, and they're difficult, but we'll get back to that. Appointment of other similar advocates in other contexts was encouraged, and you'll see from the report which was released last week that they do a great job. Our roles are system-wide, not only about peacekeeping, but there's a real desire to say it's all about these uniformed personnel. They're entirely new functions for the UN. The terms of reference are vague. We don't have resources. I don't have any activities money in my budget. The field victims' rights advocates have very little money in order to provide support to victim survivors. And we more or less have had to work out, make up what we're supposed to do as we've gone along. And firstly, and more or less I was on my own, I focused on advocacy, pure advocacy, consultations with stakeholders, all sorts of stakeholders, including member states, explaining what a victims' rights-centered approach meant. I also work very closely with the field victims' rights advocates to establish themselves as the main contact for victims. I started also traveling. There's one particular non-governmental organization that doesn't like me a lot and says that I've traveled the world. I haven't. I have indeed traveled the world, but I have to say they haven't been, the places that I have traveled are not exactly luxury destinations. I have, my first visit was to the Central African Republic 3 weeks after I started work. And since then, I've been to 6 other countries, and I went back to the Central African Republic. And all of these countries that I go to have varying UN presences. And one of those countries is Lebanon, in fact. So it would be very interesting to talk to you about the issues in Lebanon, which are very complex indeed. During each of these visits, I've met victims individually and confidentially, and that really showed me what I was supposed to do, because they all spoke of the same things. Complaint procedures, pathways were difficult, they were not protected, they had limited assistance on many things, immediate assistance. They were very concerned about their children, those born of sexual exploitation and abuse. They didn't like the investigative procedures, they didn't like being interviewed a lot. They didn't like the fact that there was very limited support for paternity child support claims, and they were very concerned they didn't hear much about the progress of their cases. Strangely, I mean, not strangely.
Can I ask you here just to pause on this for a second, because this is, I think, you're sharing kind of the feedback that the victims are giving you on these visits, and I think this is a central place for a focus. And I'm wondering if you would be able to, as you described before, kind of maybe pause, and obviously without giving away any identifying details, just share a little bit of like what some of these stories are like, right? What some of these lived experiences are like, particularly around, you noted before, this term exploitation economy and the contested nature of consent. And I think if we could zoom in and kind of understand like what might that look like, or what might that mean in the day-to-day of how the UN or how a peacekeeping mission within the UN is interacting in these settings, for maybe some of the people listening who are still wondering, okay, but what does that look like? What is it that these victims are experiencing?
It raises a lot of issues, and some of those issues are uncomfortable. The people that we're working with, the peacekeepers are there to keep the peace or to build the peace. It depends on the nature of the mandate. Their interaction, and this is the civilians as well as the uniformed personnel, their interaction with the community will be to protect and also to support mechanisms which may build peace, so to speak. There's a lot of, in terms of uniformed personnel, there's a lot of emphasis put on risk mitigation. So to ensure that there isn't too much interaction with the community. There must be interaction with the community, but there isn't interaction with the community to identify places where there could be difficult, capacities for interaction with the community, which may lead to sexual exploitation generally. Abuse is likely to be a failure to understand that the interaction is with a child. The sort of gang rapes and so on are not, could not be, they're not exactly what goes on really, though they do happen. But the issue is that these people are in extraordinarily vulnerable situations. And in some of these countries, not all, sex work is legal. And even if it is not legal, it is tolerated. So you will have people who are engaged in sex work, you will have people who are not engaged in sex work, but can see that one way they may be able to sustain themselves and their families is to gain some sort of benefit from those who have those who have things. And I don't think you can underrate the level of power in a person who is a UN staff member, irrespective of the level of the UN staff member. And this is very well pointed out by the issues in the Eastern Congo relating to the Ebola response, which indeed didn't involve, the mission wasn't involved, the allegations don't concern mission personnel, but humanitarian personnel. Those people come in, they have a bit of money, they mightn't have a lot of money, but they certainly have a lot more money than the people who are in very difficult situations already because they're in a war-torn country, and then you put on top of that Ebola, so they will do anything. So that's what we're looking at. So irrespective of what appears to be consent, you have sexual exploitation. So that's essentially the differential of power, the extremely vulnerable situations of the people. I don't say they're vulnerable people because people are not vulnerable per se. And this creates a scenario where sexual exploitation can occur, and indeed abuse. And it's interesting to know, for example, the field victims rights advocate in Central African Republic recently was involved with work late last year, involved in work with sex workers in the Central African Republic. Now, sex work is illegal in the Central African Republic, but notwithstanding that, people engage in it. Those women, and they were women, were unaware that UN personnel were prohibited from engaging in sex work with them. You know, they were prohibited from having, you know, sort of being a part of this transaction. And that was extraordinary. I mean, the people in the countries do not know. There's a power imbalance, and there are risks, and it's very hard. And with those conversations with the women I have, they don't talk about accountability of the perpetrator. They talk about what they need, and they need medical assistance. They, more than anything, they need support so they can get livelihoods. They often don't report until, well, certainly with sexual exploitation, they will not report until the exploitative relationship ends, because they no longer have what they consider, they're not receiving what they consider to be the benefit. So often it is when the personnel leaves, or they will disclose abuse, but maybe that there will be a way that it is negotiated with the community and the perpetrator, or the family and the perpetrator. So that comes another issue. But they will disclose frequently also if there's a child involved. So it's very, very difficult. And how you deal with this, but I'm sure you've seen that yourself. This is, you know, how do you, I think we put a lot of burden on the victim survivor. It is, you know, you come forward with the allegation rather than thinking of creating a scenario wherein there's some form of empowerment so you don't have your allegation. I mean, it shouldn't be, you know, you have to find the complaint box, and these may not be exactly appropriate for the context in which you're working. And maybe in the wrong language. It's very, I mean, we have, for example, the Rohingya in Bangladesh, they may not use the language that people have set up the complaint mechanism in. So, but there, I mean, it's just, so in that context, what we need to do for our personnel is to make them understand the situation, and it will vary from context to context.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, you know, what you're bringing out, and it was good to see even in the SG's report a recognition that from the point of view of someone living in these contexts, they may not know which UN agency the perpetrator works for, or even—
No, they don't. And right. Anyone with a white car, and they're all in white cars driving at perhaps too fast, but they're all in white cars, and so Care, Caritas, whatever, Oxfam, the UN, everybody will be zipping around in these, white cars, so they'll think that they're all UN really, not to be, too proud of the organization. The steps in terms of measures to address sexual exploitation or abuse, the UN put in place measures earlier, and many lag behind. And it is interesting, for example, it was only January last year, 2020, that NATO, and it has people out there with guns and such, NATO adopted a policy on sexual exploitation and abuse. So it's and then you look at, I was looking at something from the Global Fund. There's a report on the Global Fund, which is a conglomeration of, as you know, of UN and non-UN entities dealing with health issues and so on. It is lagging behind with its policy on sexual exploitation and abuse. So we did it, but people are, and entities are catching up. But what we need to do is to have a comprehensive approach and understanding that the UN is not special in terms of anything. You can't, if you have this inequality, if you have a scenario where people need something, you have a great risk. And you need to, a lot has to be done about the, I don't know, I say it's not that people always say culture change and so on, but I think culture change is a long process. You just have to make sure the behavior stops, and hopefully at some point a culture will catch up.
Yeah, and I do want to transition us to the Q&A section, because we're having some great questions come in, and I know you really value that. What are...
Yeah, I do indeed. I just wanted to finish 2 minutes, maybe 3. I think that my role, I don't think is, I mean, it's not me, but the fact there is the role is really important. But more important is that it is reflected on the ground by the field victims' rights advocates, sometimes called the senior victims' rights officers. The UN can't ever do anything simply. So the work they've done on the ground, which is described in the Secretary General's report and also in my informal report on our activities in 2019, and new ones coming out soon on 2020. That's the most important thing. And they have shown that just having someone in a country who is there for victim survivors will advocate for them rather than, they won't talk about due process rights of the offender, so to speak, is very important. And you'll see, although they seem to be tiny little things, making sure that women can have a bank account so that they receive payments from the fathers if the fathers agree, making sure that they can deliver their babies in hospitals, making sure that their children can go to school. That makes a huge difference, and that's all been done. I support them, of course, by the field victims' rights advocates, the people on the ground. And because of that, our entities, many of our colleagues, our officers on the ground are looking to include victims' rights functions in the job description of a staff member, or indeed looking to create victims' rights advocates. So I'll stop at that point, and I'm sure there are many questions, and I do value. It's very difficult. I've said this. I used to, as you heard, I used to teach at universities, and I always relied on looking at the students, because you can tell very easily if you're boring them to death, if they want to interact, and you can't tell anything here. It's very hard. I can't see anyone's eyes. I can't see the people sleeping. I did teach in Hong Kong, and they used to, this was hilarious. They would come in, and they were in the evening, and what they would do is they'd put on, it was the days of the Sunny Walkman. Probably you were all too young to remember it. They'd put that on the desk, turn it on, and then they would go to sleep. So I would be speaking to a sleeping auditorium with many sunny Walkmans, but very similar, I suppose, to today.
No, it is hard. And I really appreciate everyone tuning in. And I think we'll have people listening later. And just to kind of reflect back, some of the things that you were sharing, and really a lot of what you shared is kind of what we wanted to ask about. So it was really your role, but also, you touched on this imbalance of power, right? This underlying imbalance that really is the root cause of exploitation, abuse, and also the power that, knowing that it's not as great as it should be, like having this role and having the ability now to have feel.
Alina, I think, is it my unstable thing? You seem to have frozen.
I think we might have lost Alina for the moment.
Yeah. So you pick up.
So why don't I'll invite our student participants to join us, Katrina, Megan, and Jesse. And if you want to go ahead and start asking some of the questions.
Yep, I can start. So we do have one question from Even Papworth. Sorry if I'm saying anyone's name wrong. And they would like to know, there have been many calls to increase women's participation in peacekeeping as a way to lower incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse of the host population. However, based on research of similar military organization, is it likely that some of these women will also face harassment from fellow uniformed personnel? Do you think that these two types of gender-based violence are related? If so, could the work of the VRA also address sexual harassment of uniformed women?
Very interesting question. One thing I want to say is, and I'm sure the questioner didn't want to imply this, I think that having more women in uniform, more women in peacekeeping, peace building is absolutely essential, not only to address sexual exploitation or abuse, but it's essentially they should be able to participate in whatever they want to participate in, and they do provide those who do work in these contexts are very valuable. People speak of their specific capacity. And that's not only why we need them there. I think certainly if there were more women in peacekeeping contexts, I believe that this would have a positive effect in terms of addressing sexual exploitation and or abuse. I do know, however, that they have been subject. I don't work on this area in particular, but I do know that there have been incidences of sexual harassment of women personnel by male personnel because they're living in the same context. But this can, the risk factors can be addressed, and so can the behaviour of the male personnel. But this requires a lot of effort because we can see the behaviour of men in power generally tends to be such that if they have a feeling of entitlement, it seems. And I'm Australian, as you can hear from my accent, and any of you who've been following what is going on in Australia with regard to the Parliament will know that men in positions of men who feel that they're powerful are able to, because of the power imbalance, to be able to consider for some reason that they're entitled. They know that they're often protected because those to whom reports will be made are often they're often their peers, and then they know that people will not necessarily report these incidences because it may affect their opportunities for a career advancement and so on. I do have a little bit to do with sexual harassment because the underlying issues are the same. The underlying issues relate to power imbalance, senses of entitlement, fear of your own situation, fear of retaliation, and so on and so forth. And because of that, people do come to me who've been subject to sexual harassment. And currently I'm working on a document which is for the whole UN system, a set of principles, very short document, which will inform a victim-centered approach to sexual harassment. So shifting to the affected person. And in that context, I like to focus on safety at work and focus on the fact that it is the organization's responsibility to ensure that women, and we're not only talking, when you're talking of victim survivors, you can't imagine what they're going to look like, because they can be men, LGBTIQ plus people, and they are often people, and this is the same with sexual exploitation and abuse. The disempowerment or the discrimination these people are affected by is multiple. So people who are so women, younger women with disabilities. So is and there's of course the intersection of race and gender. So we've got to be very. You can't be. Nothing's binary. And you have to be quite nuanced in the way you look at the risks, and you look at the empowerment of people who might be in a situation of vulnerability and might be affected by that power imbalance. So it is something I work on, but I haven't got a specific role with regard to women in uniform, women in but I do work with them. I mean, it's not my role. My role was designed because the Secretary General was very focused on the abuse, the exploitation of beneficiaries in contexts where the UN is supposed to be doing something good. But because of the underlying commonalities, I have become involved in sexual harassment as well.
So we have our next question from Sarah Ogundare. Sorry, Sarah, if I mispronounced your last name. She asks, what measures have the UN put into place to ensure that their staff are culturally competent and culturally humble? I ask this because lack of cultural competence and humility may be a considerable contributor to sexual misconduct.
Well, what have we put in place? I think this is a work in progress. There are multiple, and I did in fact teach a person called Jide Ogundare, so I wonder whether Sarah is related. But there have been multiple training packages. And training is compulsory. We need to involve ourselves in online training on sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual harassment. Pre-deployment training is compulsory for uniformed personnel. There's continual training and so on that goes on at the field level. But these things I don't think are enough. So we're turning a lot now to much more participatory sort of encounters. We have an annual discussion on ethical issues, which is focused on just talking through issues and making people understand inequality, making people understand their privilege, and making people to understand, as Sarah pointed out, their lack of humility. And at the end of last year, I participated in one, and this was a very interesting one, and it was run twice. This was for the heads of UN entities who were asked to participate in discussions of sexual harassment using a case study, sort of focusing on real live case studies. And that was very interesting because although we have at the UN level, the Secretary General is very proud of this. We've got 50-50 in terms of the leaders of the big entities. It was very interesting to hear the reflections of the senior leaders of our organizations. In full disclosure, I've been working on issues relating to violence and gender-based violence against women, violence against children since I was 22. And I'm very old now, but most of my colleagues have not had much to do with these issues. So, and you can be amazed by the surprise that they have when they hear about issues such as privilege, inequality, intersectional discrimination, and that people are scared. I mean, that their junior staff are scared, that they don't want to come forward, and that there's a sort of kinship amongst leaders, so to speak.
So something that I was hoping to ask you is, I'm kind of curious about what kinds of initiatives are being created to offer longer term support for survivors who may be temporarily or continuously mobile through various different locations and countries, as opposed to remaining in one location, because the initial capacity to report is one entire issue, and longer term support is in itself a whole other separate issue.
I think the best thing that I can talk about are the various, and they sound, when you talk about a project, it sounds a little small, but it is a little small. We have a small trust fund in support of victims of sexual exploitation or abuse and abuse. And just on the word victim survivor, I mean, my title is Victims' Rights Advocates, and the reason for that is that is the word that is used in the UN, and you'll probably be familiar with the fact that there are victims' rights advocates in national systems. Certainly there are many in the US, and they are called victims' rights advocates, and you'll all be familiar with the long debate, including and Roxanne Gay. I really like her work. She's very involved in talking about, she's quite happy to be called a victim, and I quite like the word victim because you don't lose the perpetrator, whereas a survivor, to me, it puts a lot of pressure on a person and you forget. But anyway, it's whatever anyone wants to be called, how they, what I'm not going to tell people what to call people. How people identify, how they wish to describe themselves is interesting for me. In terms of this trust fund, it supports, and there are other funds as well, that support livelihood programs for women. Not only women, but not only for victim survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, but also those in the community that might be in vulnerable situations and could benefit. And that goes to, sort of strengthen the community, and then they're not in a situation where they're at risk. So you've got to do two things. You've got to deal with those who might create the risk and those who may be subject to the risk. And these programs, and they're quite small, have been, their direction has been to build livelihood capacity for these women. And you'll see in, for example, Democratic Republic of the Congo, there are 9 of these projects across the country, and they provide skills such as mushroom farming, tailoring, and I know it sounds stereotypical, but you will be amazed how many clothes people wear, and beauty, and it makes it. And there's one woman who's sold school uniforms. She's learned tailoring and been able to subsist that way. Maize flour production, things of that nature. We have a similar one in Haiti, which deals with livelihood support, and also the support for children's education. So those things, and we had a press conference last week on when the report of the Secretary General was launched, and you can all look at that, and the field victims' rights advocate from Democratic Republic of the Congo speaks of, and these are individual cases, she speaks of how one of the women who's received, and she was a child when she was subject to sexual abuse, and she has a child of her own. She has been able to sell her clothes and so on, and she's bought a plot of land, and she's moving on. And certainly, notwithstanding how small these projects sound, the people concerned are getting more from the skills they acquire than they did from an interaction with someone who is a UN staff member. Because they're not being really supported in any big way through the exploitation. But I want to see much more of this, because it's getting to the root cause is not only about talking about power and inequality with those who might perpetrate the exploitation or the abuse. It is making sure that people are equipped. So there's a protective shield, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you, Jessie, Katrina, and Megan. I think that's a great note to end on, and we're coming to the end of our time. But I can't thank you enough and your office for organizing this time and this reflection, and in particular Kiyo Hasegawa, Stefania Di Filippo, and Jackie Woodford from your office. So always want to thank the people working to make these things happen. And we really want to invite students to continue to keep these conversations alive in their classrooms and in their workplaces, particularly those of you that go on to work in these settings. And as you said, there's many ways to respond, but it's really important to address kind of these underlying causes and to focus on that as well. And that's what we aim to do. So we have the hashtags and the places you can follow the work here. And we also have our own kind of request for feedback. We like to practice what we preach. And so if you do have any feedback around what you enjoyed about this, what you'd like to hear more about, what we could do better, please let us know. But we'll just end by thanking all of the panelists. And again, thanking you, Jane, for this time.
Well, let me thank you, and let me end on, we do have internships. So if anyone's interested, please have a look at how you can apply to be an intern if you want to be one. You're not paid, unfortunately. And then there's a possibility for you to be an online volunteer. That again, you can be in touch with us. We have a Twitter account, and some of the interns have spoken, the volunteers have spoken about their work. There is Kiyo has sent the Twitter link, and we see it on the screen there as well. I'm just very grateful. And I'm very grateful for the questions, and I wish we'd had more time to have more questions, and it would be great for anyone who's interested to follow the work, contribute to the work, because there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Jane. Really appreciate it.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Have a great day and a great weekend.
You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.